Hello there, and welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Thank you for joining us. If you're new here, feel free to get comfortable, take a deep breath, and ease into this calm journey through the past. And if you're a returning listener, thank you for watching. We're glad to have you back. Before we begin, just a gentle nudge. If you enjoy this kind of peaceful, sleepy history, please consider subscribing. It helps us continue bringing you more stories from the quiet corners of the past. And while you're settling in, feel free to let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see this global bedtime circle unfold. Now, let your mind drift slowly back in time to a world where things looked familiar but felt entirely different. A world of flickering torches and worn wooden floorboards, of woolen garments and open hearths, of winding alleyways and clanging church bells. This is the Middle Ages, but not the shining armor and grand feasts you might expect. Tonight, we're going to gently wade into a far more ordinary and revealing part of life in medieval Europe: hygiene. The habits, rituals, and quiet struggles of keeping clean in a world without plumbing, without soap as we know it, and without our modern understanding of disease. We'll explore the rhythm of their lives, the quiet persistence of their routines, and the daily compromises that shaped their survival. So close your eyes and imagine yourself in a world where water was precious, where smells told stories, and where cleanliness meant something very different than it does today. Let us begin. The first light of dawn creeps through a small opening in the wooden shutter. The air inside the cottage is cool and still. Outside, the faint crow of a rooster echoes across the sleeping village. You are lying on a straw-stuffed mattress, the scent of dried rushes and last night's embers hanging faintly in the air. There is no alarm, no clock, no running water. The rhythm of your day is governed by the sun and by necessity. You rise slowly, brushing bits of hay from your woolen tunic. The rushes underfoot are damp-softened by the moisture that creeps through the dirt floor during the night. You reach for a wooden basin, filled the evening before with water from the village well. It is cold to the touch. You splash some on your face, brisk and refreshing. Though there is no soap, only a scrap of coarse cloth to wipe away the night's residue. There is no mirror, no toothpaste. Your teeth are scrubbed lightly with a piece of linen dipped in salt, if you have any to spare. A few rub with ashes from the hearth. Some chew on twigs to freshen the mouth. Simple, habitual gestures passed down over generations. Outside, the village is slowly waking. Thin trails of smoke rise from chimneys. A woman leans over a barrel, rinsing linen in lye-soaked water, her hands red from the caustic solution. She wears a scarf wrapped around her head, partly for warmth, partly to keep lice at bay. Children run barefoot over packed dirt, their legs streaked with dried mud from yesterday's play. A man carries a bucket to the communal privy at the edge of the village, a rough wooden stall over a pit, shared by several families. Others simply relieve themselves in the woods. There are smells of animals, of smoke, of sweat, but no one complains. It is simply how things are. People are accustomed to the earthy perfume of daily life. Some even believe bathing too frequently weakens the body, exposing it to illness. Cleanliness is a balance, not a goal. In the late morning, the bathhouse might open, if your village is lucky enough to have one. It's a small timber structure by the stream, heated by stone stoves. A fire keeps the water warm, and families bathe together in shifts. Modesty is a fluid idea. Here often, dictated more by class than by shame. But bathhouses are not always available. In some towns, they've closed, blamed for the spread of disease or for moral decay. In such places, the wooden basin at home is your only luxury. By midday, the sun is high. The labor begins. Hygiene is left behind for now. Sweat will come, and dust, and mud work and weather will mark the body again. But for a moment, this morning, there was a ritual. A small, deliberate act of care. Enough to carry you through another day. Now, let us leave behind the quiet hum of village life and drift gently toward the world of royalty. Across the channel, in the heart of 13th century France, a very different rhythm unfolds. Here, in the great halls of royal power, hygiene takes on a peculiar prominence, not as a science, but as a reflection of virtue, piety, and control. King Louis IX of France, later known as Saint Louis, was not merely a monarch, but a man deeply obsessed with purity, both moral and physical. He rose early, often before the first bells rang out from the chapels beyond the palace walls. His morning began not with lavish robes or courtiers' greetings, but with ablutions. A basin of warmed water was brought to his private chambers. He would cleanse his face and hands methodically, often washing his feet, as well, an uncommon ritual even among nobles. Servants whispered that he bathed more than any king they had known. In a time when many feared water, Louis embraced it. The royal bathhouse was stocked with aromatic herbs, rose petals, chamomile, sage, and wooden tubs, large enough to sit upright. He bathed once or twice each week, sometimes more, a routine considered excessive by his peers. But Louis believed that cleanliness honored God. He insisted that his courtiers present themselves with clean garments and trimmed nails. He inspected his children after their baths, running his fingers along their necks and wrists to ensure no dirt lingered in the folds of the skin. Linen garments were changed often, sometimes daily. Underclothes were boiled and hung in open air. He ordered the building of hospitals where the poor could bathe, and even provided them with sandals and fresh tunics. After this was not merely charity. To Louis, cleanliness was a form of sanctity. Even during the Crusades, when he marched through the dusty plains of Egypt, he maintained his habits. In enemy territory, under siege, suffering from dysentery and heat stroke, he still requested warm water to bathe. His tent was rigged with curtains for privacy. He kept lavender and vinegar nearby to sweeten the air and cleanse the skin. And yet, his approach was not medical. Germs were unknown. Disease was attributed to miasmus, bad air, and moral failing. Still, Louis believed that purity of body could ward off illness of spirit. He died in 1270 on a foreign shore, likely of dysentery. But he left behind a strange and rare legacy for his time. A monarch remembered as much for his soap and sandals as for his sword and scepter. Even now, centuries later, the diaries and documents describing his bathing habits seem oddly detailed, almost reverent. In a time when filth was the norm, one man's devotion to washing became a mark of sainthood. Let's step quietly away now from the polished floors of the Capetian court and follow the slow path toward the deeper customs of the age. In the quiet foundations beneath many modern European cities lie the hushed remnants of a once thriving feature of daily medieval life: the public bathhouse. Stone-lined pools, clay drainage channels, and the blackened hearths of long-cooled furnaces tell a story we often forget. A story of a society far more accustomed to communal bathing than we might assume. Across medieval Europe, from the narrow lanes of York to the winding alleys of Nuremberg, bathhouses were not only present, they were popular, and their gradual disappearance remains one of the quieter mysteries of history. Imagine walking through a town in the 12th century. The street is uneven, paved with worn stones and muddy corners. A sign swings gently overhead, a bundle of twigs, a carved wooden basin, a painted towel, symbols indicating the presence of a stew, as they were often called. These bathhouses, open to the public for a small fee, offered more than just warmth and water. They were social places. Relaxation, gossip, and even dining often took place under their timber roofs. Inside, the air was thick with steam and herbal scent. Sage, mint, and thyme were commonly steeped in hot water. Wooden tubs lined the walls. Men and women bathed separately, usually, but not always. Mixed bathing was more common than later centuries would admit. In some regions, a screen or a change in hours preserved modesty. In others, there was no such formality. Bathers scrubbed themselves with rough linen or scraped their skin with blunt knives to remove dirt and oil, a method borrowed from Roman traditions. Attendants brought warm towels, poured water over shoulders, and helped rinse hair. There was music, laughter, and, sometimes, a meal served on small tables while bathers soaked. But by the late 14th and early 15th centuries, many of these places had begun to vanish. The reasons are layered and still debated. The arrival of the Black Death in 1347 dealt a psychological blow to public spaces. Though the bathhouses were not blamed directly, the idea of shared water became uneasy. Theories of contagion evolved, and suspicions grew. Moral reform also played its part. As religious movements gained influence, many bathhouses became associated with sin: too much exposed flesh, too much casual mingling. Some stews became fronts for brothels, and regulation tightened. In London, for example, the city eventually banned mixed bathing and later closed many establishments altogether. Archaeologists today often find only traces: charred wood, fragments of glazed tile, and drainage channels that once carried warm water to a street long since buried. The names of the bathhouses, the Swan, the White Rose, the Angel, echo faintly through property records and parish fines. And so, slowly, the practice faded. In colder regions, people returned to the basin by the hearth. In wealthier homes, private baths became a rare indulgence. But the era of the bustling public bathhouse had ended, leaving behind only whispers. In many ways, the mystery isn't why the bathhouses vanished, but how their story was quietly omitted from common memory. We often imagine the medieval world as one of perpetual filth, but for a time, the warmth of steam and the comfort of ritual bathing was part of the weekly rhythm, a lost tradition, quietly waiting beneath layers of earth and centuries of silence. Now let us turn away from the bathhouses and city streets and step quietly through the worn stone archway of a medieval monastery. Here, beyond the cloistered walls, life moves according to a different rhythm, a rhythm marked by bells, prayer, and silence. The monastery is not a place of luxury, nor is it squalid. It is a world apart, and within this world, hygiene holds a particular kind of sacred meaning. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many monastic communities in the West, included specific instructions regarding cleanliness, not for comfort, but for discipline and humility. Bodily care was seen as necessary, but always secondary to the needs of the soul. Imagine yourself rising at the first chime of the morning bell, before the sun crests the hills. The dormitory is cold, its stone floor chilled with night air. Monks or nuns dress in silence, fastening their coarse habits. Each has a simple wooden comb tucked into a belt or a pouch to be used once a day. Hair was kept trimmed or shaved, not for vanity, but to reduce distraction and maintain uniformity. The day begins with communal prayer. Only afterward do routines of hygiene unfold. There is no soap in the modern sense-only ash or clay, sometimes lye, sometimes sand. Washing is performed at a central basin, often carved from stone. Water is brought by hand or channeled from nearby springs. In larger abbeys, a lavatorium, a long trough built against the refectory wall, allowed monks to wash their hands before meals, as required by custom. Bathing the full body was permitted, but sparingly. Once or twice a year was typical, though allowances were made for the ill or infirm. The baths themselves were austere: a tub, a bucket of heated water, and a cloth. Silence was expected, even in bathing. The focus was not on indulgence, but on order. Laundry was a regular task. Robes were washed every few weeks, sometimes less, depending on resources. Lice combs were common, and some abbeys employed young lay brothers or outside workers to shave heads and launder clothing. Sand and vinegar were used to scrub benches, tools, and hands, part of a quiet, ongoing battle against decay and dirt. The use of latrines was regulated as well. Large monasteries constructed sophisticated waste channel, stone-lined passages that carried refuse away using diverted streams. These early sanitation systems, though simple, helped maintain cleanliness and minimized disease. But they were labor-intensive, and their maintenance fell to the lowest-ranking workers in the community. For nuns, hygiene carried the same expectations: modesty, discipline, and restraint. Their routines mirrored those of their male counterparts, though often with fewer resources. In small convents, each woman managed her own linen, her own washing, a shared basin in the cloister garden, a small towel hung to dry. The daily effort to remain clean was quiet, repetitive, and deeply tied to spiritual focus. Not cleanliness for its own sake, but as an expression of order in a disordered world. And so the monastic community moved through its days between psalms and meals. Silence and service anchored in a kind of cleanliness that was both practical and symbolic, a contrast not only to the filth of the roads beyond, but also to the indulgence of noble courts or the chaos of plague-stricken cities. In this stillness, in this quiet echo of bells and footsteps on stone, hygiene became a part of the sacred rhythm, a steady act of devotion in a world constantly touched by dust and time. Let us now step softly into a medieval city, perhaps London, or Paris, or Ghent, a tangle of narrow streets, timber-framed houses leaning toward one another, and the ever-present hum of daily life. It is morning, and the streets are already alive. Bakers pull open their shutters, letting the scent of coarse bread and wood smoke drift outward. Vendors wheel carts across uneven cobblestones, their wheels groaning over the ridges and ruts worn deep by decades of use. And then there are the other smells. Beneath the charm of merchant cries and chiming bells lies the less romantic truth. Urban hygiene was a challenge, a constant, grinding struggle against the press of humanity. Imagine the street beneath your feet. It is not paved in stone, but in packed dirt, trodden down by countless hooves and shoes. In dry weather, it crumbles into powder. In rain, it becomes a thick, clinging mire. Waste disposal is informal. Chamber pots are emptied into gutters. Rotted vegetables, animal entrails, the leavings of 1,000 meals find their way into the open drains. These channels, shallow and uncovered, run along the edges of the street, carrying refuse downward toward rivers or cesspools, or sometimes simply pooling into stillness. The city tries. Ordinances are posted, fines are levied, but enforcement is irregular, and the volume of waste far outweighs the means of control. There are those who work to contain ithrakers, who collect solid waste in carts and dump it outside the city gates. The gong farmers, who shovel out the contents of cesspits under homes and taverns, hauling the heavy barrels by hand, mostly at night. Their work is necessary, but it is thankless and often feared. People learn to navigate the city tactfully. They walk along the center when it's dry, the edges when it's wet. They lift their robes or skirts. They step carefully, and they keep handkerchiefs tucked into their sleeves, scented with lavender or cloves. Even inside the homes, cleanliness is hard-won. Wooden floors are swept, then covered with rushes, dried grasses, or herbs that catch dirt, absorb spills, and soften the steps. These are replaced infrequently, a few times a year, if at all. In wealthier homes, sweet-smelling herbs like rosemary or meadowsweet are mixed into the layers. In poorer dwellings, straw and hay must suffice. Furniture is wiped down with rags. Water is drawn from wells or pumps. There is no plumbing. Every bucket is carried by hand, and every drop of water must be wadoozed first for cooking, then for rinsing, then for cleaning. Despite this, people care for their homes. They take pride in small acts of order: a swept hearth, a polished pewter cup, a fresh linen cloth laid across the table. Children are washed in basins. Clothes are aired in the sun. Toothpicks often made of bonar, used after meals, and combs, carved from wood or horn, pass slowly through tangled hair each morning. The city, for all its filth, is not without rhythm. It moves, it breathes, it adjusts. People adapt. They learn when to step aside, when to speak, when to clean. And within the noise and grime, there is a kind of resilience, a quiet, practical effort to remain human in a world that rarely makes it easy. Now let us drift into a gentler space, a quiet garden, walled and fragrant, where herbs stretch toward the sun and bees hum among the blooms. This is the garden of a 12th century abbey in the Rhineland, where one remarkable woman watched, listened, and wrote. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine abbess, visionary, composer, and healer. Hildegard stood at the intersection of medicine, faith, and natural philosophy. She lived from 1098 to 1179, and her understanding of hygiene, though filtered through the beliefs of her time, was profound in its attention to balance and the body's needs. To Hildegard, cleanliness was not simply a moral obligation, nor just a practical necessity. It was a form of harmony, an extension of the divine order. She wrote extensively about health and disease in her works, Physica and Causi et Curae texts that examined the body in poetic and spiritual terms, yet with a foundation of sharp observation. She believed that the body produced waste that needed to be regularly expelled, and that sweating, bathing, and purging had their place in keeping the humors balanced. Her recommendations were detailed and deeply rooted in the natural world. She described herbal baths, sage to soothe the nerves, chamomile to soften the skin, lavender to quiet the heart. She advised that water be neither too hot nor too cold. Extremes, she wrote, disturbed the vital forces within. Clean garments were encouraged. She noted that wool worn too long became heavy with sweat and needed to be aired and washed. Undergarments of linen were preferred, as they breathed more easily and absorbed excess moisture. For the sick, Hildegard prescribed regular washing not to eliminate germs, which were unknown, but to remove foulness and restore vitality. Warm sponges infused with herbs were used to clean the forehead, neck, and hands of patients. The sick were to be kept in clean, well-ventilated spaces, and bedding was to be changed regularly. She even addressed dental hygiene. Hildegard suggested chewing on fennel seeds or the bark of certain trees to clean the mouth and freshen the breath. She encouraged the use of herbal rinses and warm water to soothe sore gums. But perhaps most remarkable was her insistence that inner cleanliness, peace of spirit, clarity of thought was inseparable from physical well-being. To her, hygiene was part of the full care of a human being. And yet, Hildegard was not isolated in her thinking. She was part of a broader tradition of women in religious life who served as healers and caretakers. Through her writings and letters, she preserved a vision of health that blended observation with mysticism, care with curiosity. In her cloister, in her garden, and in her small apothecary of drying herbs and scented oils, Hildegard shaped a vision of hygiene that was both deeply medieval and surprisingly timeless. We leave her now standing quietly at the edge of her garden, basket in hand, gathering mint and marjoram as the morning sun filters through the branches from her care, her wisdom, and her cleanliness to a world just beginning to listen. Archaeologists are often the quiet translators of forgotten lives. Their work is slow, careful, and grounded in fragments: a comb made of horn, a wooden toothpick, a crust of lye soap hardened to stone. But perhaps the most telling records of hygiene in the Middle Ages come not from objects, but from the bones themselves. In burial sites across Europe, from rural graveyards to crowded plague pits, human remains whisper details that written records omit. They tell stories not of kings or saints, but of ordinary people and the conditions they endured. Take the teeth. In many excavated skeletons, especially those from the lower classes, tooth wear is significant. Molars ground nearly flat, enamel worn thin. This was not caused by sweets, which were rare and expensive, but by grit. Flour, ground in stone mills, often carried tiny fragments of sand and rock that slowly abraded teeth with every bite of bread. There was no dental care beyond the most rudimentary efforts: chewing certain woods, rinsing with vinegar, or plucking a painful tooth by hand or with crude iron tools. But still, cavities were surprisingly uncommon until sugar became widespread in the post-medieval period. The wear was rough, but the rot was slow. Lice and fleas are harder to track, but not invisible. Traces have been found in ancient textiles. Hair combs, excavated from graves, show tiny scratches from daily use, while knit combs, fine-toothed tools used to remove lice eggs, have been recovered, some still bearing remnants of their work. In larger monastic sites, skeletal evidence sometimes shows the long-term health effects of routine bathing and better sanitation. Fewer signs of chronic skin infections, slightly longer average lifespans, more healed fractures, suggesting access to sustained care. But in crowded cities, the story turns. Bones show signs of stress, malnutrition, infections, and chronic inflammation. Leg bones bowed from rickets, spines twisted from repeated lifting and bending, and in many children's skeletons, enamel hypoplasia, faint line or groove on a tooth marks, a period of extreme physical stress, often linked to disease or starvation. Bathhouse remains sometimes contain bundles of discarded clothing, soapstone fragments, and even discarded strigils, curved blades used to scrape oil and dirt from the skin. Nearby, cesspits and midden heaps preserve centuries of discarded hygiene tools, cloth wipes, broken pottery, burnt herbs. And then there is the evidence of the plague. In certain burial grounds, layers of lime cover bodies hurriedly buried. These lime pits were meant to suppress the smell and slow decomposition. Some of these graves show bodies buried with minimal clothing, or wrapped only in shrouds, too many, too fast, no time for ritual. Despite the lack of modern cleanliness, people tried. The bones make it clear. Worn down teeth, combs used to the point of splintering, and shoulders reshaped by years of hauling water. These are not signs of neglect, but of constant, grinding effort. What the skeletons reveal is not just hardship, but persistence, a daily attempt to stay clean, or at least dignified, in a world that offered little comfort. And as we look upon those remains laid to rest under soil and time, we begin to see not caricatures of filth, but human beings, doing their best, quietly, patiently, in every small act of care. The medieval castle, imposing, fortified, and filled with contradiction, offers a very different window into hygiene. A servant carries a copper basin to the Lord's chamber, water warmed over coals. Another holds a linen towel embroidered with the family crest. The chamber smells faintly of beeswax, sweat. Nobles were more concerned with appearances than sanitation. Clean clothing mattered far more than a clean body. Outer garments were brushed and perfumed. That depended. Castles had access to more water than most homes. Cisterns collected rainwater. Servants hauled barrels from nearby rivers. The wealthy sometimes bathed weekly, or after travel, illness, or feasts. Herbal oils and rose petals were added. Scented towels were draped nearby. Privacy varied. A noblewoman might bathe behind a screen while ladies-in-waiting assisted her. A knight might strip and soak after training, attended by squires. Children were bathed more often, their skin deemed delicate and in need of greater care. Toilets in castles, often referred to as garderobes, were narrow stone chambers built into outer walls. Waste dropped down long shafts into pits or moats below. Lime was sometimes added to mask the smell. Ventilation was rudimentary, and many garderobes doubled as closet space, literally. Hanging garments there allowed the ammonia in the air to deter moths. The task was foul and constant. In larger castles, designated gong farmers worked overnight, dragging waste from pits and trenches. No titles, no honors, just the vital task of keeping filth at bay. Nobles relied on aromatic waters and herbal sachets to cover body odor. Cloves, lavender, sage, and rosemary were tucked into sleeves, belts, and pillows. Gloves were scented. Hair was dusted with powders. Cleanliness, in the eyes of the elite, was as much about fragrance as about soap. Parasites, lice, and fleas were common, though attempts were made to control them through combing, oils, and changes of bedding. Laundresses boiled linens in cauldrons. Hands were washed before meals with rosewater. Fingernails were cleaned with tiny knives. Beards were trimmed by barbers who also pulled teeth and lanced boils. But it was pursued with the same layered complexity that marked every part of medieval noble life. A blend of practicality, his hands freshly dried, and his scented gloves pulled on. He carries with him a quiet belief that order, appearance, and scent form a kind of shield, a protection against the chaos of the world beyond his gate. Let us now return to a more ordinary rhythm, the gentle, repetitive labor that filled so many days of the medieval year. A labor not often mentioned in chronicles or ballads, yet essential, quiet, constant, laundry. Imagine a small village near the bend of a shallow stream. The morning is cool, the grass still wet with dew. A group of women walks slowly from their homes, baskets balanced on hips or bundled in arms. Inside, linens, tunics, underclothes, swaddling cloths, all in need of care. There is no soap as we know it. Instead, there is lye caustic and sharp, made by filtering water through wood ash. It burns the skin if mishandled, but cleans effectively when diluted. Some use soapwort, a frothy plant, or stale urine, which provides ammonia to lift grease from cloth. These methods are passed down by practice, not books. Each woman knows the ratios by feel, not measure. At the stream's edge, a wide wooden plank is laid flat. Garments are soaked in cold water, then beaten rhythmically with wooden paddles or rubbed against smooth stones. The sound is steady, metronomic, a soft percussion carried on the breeze. Laundry is a social act as well. While hands scrub and shoulders bend, conversations ripple among the workers about harvests, births, neighbors, marriages, and illness. Children play nearby, splashing in the shallows, mimicking their mothers with tiny cloth scraps and toy buckets. Clothing is wrung tightly, then spread out to dry on bushes, low fences, or flat rocks warmed by the sun. In colder months, washing is rarer. Water freezes, hands crack. Winter garments are aired and brushed, not washed. The effort required is too great. In towns, larger washhouses are sometimes built near rivers, where laundresses, often women, hired by wealthier households, labor professionally. Their hands are red and raw, their backs stooped, yet their presence is vital. They handle everything from the finest linen chemises to the bloodied garments of surgeons and butchers. Clothing was not disposable. Tunics and dresses were mended repeatedly. Stains were soaked in vinegar or wine. Special stones were used to scrub away ink, blood, or wax. Even the grayest rags were patched, repurposed, and worn until they fell apart. And the drying always, the final stage. A warm day was a blessing. In poorer homes, damp clothing might be hung from rafters over the hearth, slowly steamed dry by cooking fires. The smell of wet wool and ash mingled with stew and smoke, filling the low ceilings with a heavy warmth. Clean laundry did not mean spotless. It meant wearable. It meant not soiled with sweat or filth. It was a small victory won load at a time against the creeping disorder of daily life. As the sun rises higher, the laundresses begin to fold. They gather their baskets, sling damp linens over shoulders, and walk the slow road home. The task will return next week, and the week after that, a rhythm as steady as breath, as unspoken as the changing of the seasons. Now let us shift into the shadowed memory of one of the most devastating events in European history. The year is 1348. The wind carries an uneasy stillness. Bells toll more often now, not for celebration, but for mourning. The plague has arrived. The Black Death, as it would later be called, swept across Europe with terrifying speed. Carried along trade routes, borne by fleas and rats, it crept into cities, villages, and monasteries unseen and unstoppable. But while the cause of the disease was not understood, its effects were deeply felt, and it profoundly shaped the way people thought about cleanliness and hygiene. Imagine a bustling town silenced in days, doors barred, streets emptied, white crosses painted on doors, the air thick not just with grief, but with the scent of vinegar, pitch, and burning herbs. Desperate measures meant to purify a poisoned atmosphere. Authorities and healers scrambled to respond. Doctors in long robes and beaked masks filled with fragrant herbs walked through neighborhoods, their presence both feared and oddly comforting. The herbs rosemary, lavender, camphor were not just for show. They were believed to cleanse the air, and in a way they did mask the rot. Public bathhouses, once lively spaces of cleansing and socializing, were now viewed with suspicion. The communal nature of bathing soothing in better times was now a threat. Many closed their doors. Steam was replaced by smoke, bathers by the masked and mourning. In some towns, laws were passed. Waste was to be removed more regularly. Water sources were protected. Street cleaning was mandated, though with limited success. In Venice and Milan, officials ordered the burning of contaminated belongings and the isolation of entire households. The word quarantine, from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days, emerged from this era, a measure of desperate containment. Clothing was suspected of harboring disease. Bedding and tunics were burned. Some covered themselves head to toe in waxed fabric to shield their bodies. Others doused their skin in vinegar and water, or carried pomander's small containers of herbs and resins to sniff when passing the sick. The wealthy fled to country estates. Nobles sealed their castles. Servants were dismissed. The poor, left behind, endured. And in every home, whether stone manor or thatched hut, cleanliness became entangled with fear. Monasteries, once havens of order, suffered deeply. Many religious communities were decimated. Yet those who remained washed the dying, changed bedding, and burned incense. Their routines of care suddenly infused with danger. Even years after the plague's worst wave had passed, the sense of bodily peril lingered. People remained cautious. The rituals of cleanliness, once tied to piety or comfort, were now shaded by the memory of death. The Black Death did not create modern hygiene, but it changed how people thought about filth and cleanliness. It introduced fear into the routines of washing, handling clothes, and managing space. And it laid bare a truth still echoed centuries later, that cleanliness, for all its comforts, was not yet protection. So we leave this moment gently, carrying the echoes of tolling bells and the rustle of cloth soaked in vinegar. A world trying to make sense of its suffering, one cautious, scented breath at a time. Amid the mud-caked streets and flickering torchlight, amid the cold water basins and coarse linen towels, another quiet ritual unfolded each day. It was not about health, not about disease or protection. It was about appearance, about how one wished to be seen, cosmetics. In the medieval world, the line between hygiene and vanity blurred. People did not speak of skincare or beauty routines in modern terms, but they did anoint, powder, pluck, and perfume with great cares, especially those with the means to afford such subtle transformations. For both men and women, The face was a canvas of social meaning. Pale skin was prized, a mark of nobility and refinement. It suggested a life lived indoors, far from the fields and furnaces. To achieve it, many turned to powders made from ground pearls, white lead, or chalk. These were applied carefully with cloth pads or fingertips. The textures were soft, the scents faintly floral or mineral. Eyebrows were plucked thin. Hairlines were shaved back to create a high, domed forehead, the height of fashion among courtly ladies in the 14th and 15th centuries. This odd style, elegant by contemporary standards, involved daily attention with small razors or tweezers. A clean, unbroken curve from brow to crown was considered a mark of grace. Rouge was made from crushed berries, cochineal, or ochre. Applied sparingly to cheeks and lips, it added warmth to the pale canvas beneath. Soot and charcoal were sometimes used to darken lashes or eyebrows. In Italy and France, where cosmetics flourished among the wealthy, recipes were guarded and passed among ladies of the court like whispered secrets. Scent was also central to these practices. Perfumed oils, made from rose, musk, or ambergris, were dabbed behind ears and on necks. Pomanders' hollow spheres, filled with herbs, were worn on belts or chains to sweeten the air around the body. Some were intricately crafted, tiny marvels of metalwork and design. Men, too, participated. Beards were trimmed and shaped. Hair was washed with egg yolks or lye soap. In some regions, gentlemen carried scent sachets in their sleeves or gloves. And among knights and noblemen, the shine of armor was mirrored by the polish of skin and the scent of fine oils. Church leaders, especially in more conservative regions, often condemned the use of cosmetics. They warned that altering one's appearance was vanity at best, deception at worst. But the practice continued quietly, artfully, especially in the courts and cities where fashion held sway. Archaeological finds reveal small cosmetic pots, combs carved from ivory or wood, and glass bottles once filled with perfumes. These artifacts speak softly of a personal world, a world of mirrors, powders, and private reflection. Even in times when water was scarce and bathing rare, the face remained a focal point. It was tended, shaped, adorned, and in that attention we see something familiar, a desire not just to survive, but to present oneself with intention. So while we often imagine medieval hygiene as purely practical or entirely absent here, in the quiet ritual of morning preparation, another truth lingers. People cared how they looked. They tried, they adapted, they washed with rosewater, they powdered their cheeks, and in the flicker of candlelight before the mirror, they saw not dirt or disease, but dignity. Let us now enter the chamber of a well-to-do household, or perhaps a small urban clinic, not the kind filled with bright light and polished instruments, but a low-ceilinged room with herbs hanging from beams, basins of water warming near the hearth, and the sharp temps of vinegar and smoke in the air. This is where the physicians work, and the barbers, and the apothecaries. Their realms often overlapped, their roles blurred by necessity and tradition. In the medieval elite class, healthcare was an art rooted in ritual, theory, and a surprising amount of hygiene for its time. The physician, typically university-trained, sometimes cloaked in long robes, would not touch the patient first. Observation came first. The pulse was taken. The urine examined in clear flasks, held up to the light, its color and clarity noted. A chart of humors would be consulted, and questions asked about diet, dreams, bowel movements, and even emotional temper. Treatment often involved balancing the humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Cleanliness played a role here. Sweat was seen as a way to release toxins. So too were baths, purgings, and bloodlettings. This is where the barber surgeons came in. Despite the name, their responsibilities extended far beyond cutting hair. They pulled teeth, lanced boils, set broken bones, and bled patients. Using leeches or small incisions, they believed they were drawing out excess blood to restore balance. These barbers kept their tools in leather pouches or wooden boxes: razors, knives, tweezers, combs. They cleaned their instruments, though not in the way we would expect. They might rinse in wine or heat over flame. There was no germ theory, but there was a sense that blood left on steel was dangerous. They also practiced basic wound care: washing cuts with vinegar, binding with clean cloths, and applying poultices made from honey, herbs, or resin. The cloths were boiled when possible. The hands, sometimes rinsed in brine. These were acts of intuition rather than science, but they mattered. The apothecary, meanwhile, provided the ingredients. Here, occasionally, she measured herbs, mixed salves, and distilled waters. Lavender for calm, thyme for infection, rosemary for strength. The preparation of these remedies involved heat, tools, and cleanliness. Dust ruined tinctures. Spoiled oils could sicken. Among the nobility, hygiene became part of this web of care. Clean sheets were laid for the sick. Rooms were fumigated with juniper or pine. Fresh rushes were scattered on the floor. Warmed cloths were placed on foreheads. Baths were prepared not for vanity, but for healing water infused with chamomile, sage, or vinegar to soothe aching limbs or reduce fevers. And then, quietly, there were the attendants, the ones who washed the sick, who trimmed hair and cleaned bedding, who changed garments, removed soiled linens, and swept away the remnants of illness. They are rarely named in the records, but their work was foundational. In this elite circle, hygiene was not purely about appearance. It was part of care, part of ritual, a layer of control imposed on the chaos of the body. Even as superstition and error swirled in medieval medicine, there was attention real, attention to touch, to scent, to fabric and heat, to the comfort of a clean cloth, the reassurance of an orderly room. And in these quiet acts, we glimpse something soft beneath the harsher edges of medieval life, a desire not only to heal, but to soothe. Now, let us return to the quieter corners of the medieval home: the nursery, the hearth, the wooden bench beside a window shuttered against the wind. Here, childhood unfolded, not in comfort by modern standards, but with its own rhythms, its own softness, and its own approach to cleanliness. Infants were swaddled tightly in linen bands. The practice served both to keep them warm and to encourage the straight growth of limbs, as understood by the beliefs of the time. These swaddling bands were changed regularly, not daily, but often enough to be part of the routine. Washing an infant was done with care. A small basin of warm water, a cloth, no harsh soaps if anything, a bit of milk, or a gentle herbal infusion. Lavender, if available, chamomile, or simply clean water, warmed by the hearth and tested on the inside of a wrist. Mothers or wet nurses bathed the child's face, hands, and feet. The rest was cleaned, as needed, wiped, patted, soothed with salves of beeswax or soft animal fats to prevent chafing. Linen undercloths served as rudimentary diapers. These were rinsed, scrubbed, and left to dry in the sun, often reused until threadbare. As children grew, their involvement in cleanliness expanded. A child of 5 might be expected to wash their hands before meals, sometimes using just water. Sometimes a bowl of water mixed with vinegar or ash. Their faces would be wiped after meals with a corner of a tunic or a small cloth. Their hair combed by a parent or older sibling, often while sitting on a low stool by the fire. Combs were simple but necessary. Made from wood, horn, or bone, they kept lice in check and untangled curls. Combing was part of the bedtime rhythm, along with prayers and the smoothing of blankets stuffed with straw or wool. Teeth were not brushed, but attention was paid. Children chewed on twigs, rinsed with water, or rubbed their gums with salt if it was available. Some families taught their children to rinse with herbal infusions, mint or thyme, though this was more common in towns. Bathing was rare, but not absent. On festival days, or before important family gatherings, children were bathed, more thoroughly placed in wooden tubs, water carried and warmed with great effort. This was a special event, sometimes done in silence, sometimes with laughter and splashing. Clothing for children was basic but layered. Linen closest to the skin, wool over top. These layers were changed when soiled, but not daily. Washing clothes was labor-intensive, and garments were worn repeatedly before being laundered. Stains and smells were tolerated longer than we might expect, but not ignored entirely. In winter, washing was limited. Cold water and icy air made daily cleanliness nearly impossible. Instead, dust and sweat were wiped away with cloths. Hair was braided to prevent tangling, and garments were aired near the hearth to freshen them with warmth and smoke. Children were taught by imitation. They watched their mothers wash hands before kneading bread. They saw older siblings trim nails with small knives or rub oil into dry skin. Cleanliness was not a moral virtue, it was a quiet habit, born of necessity and passed on through gesture, not instruction. And so, in these modest homes of stone or wood, tucked behind field walls or nestled within narrow city lanes, childhood unfolded in rhythms of care. Not sterile, but tended. Not spotless, but steady. A basin, a cloth, a comb, a kiss goodnight. These were the tools of hygiene in the medieval world of children, simple, enduring, and softly human. The story of cleanliness in medieval Europe is also a story of decline, how once flourishing public institutions slowly disappeared, folded under the weight of suspicion, morality, and fear. Nowhere is this shift more visible than in the fate of England's public bathhouses. During the 12th and 13th centuries, cities like London and Bath boasted a wide network of public bathing establishments. Known as stews, they were places of warmth, social gathering, and yes, hygiene. People from all walks of life, artisans, merchants, apprentices, frequented these spaces. Some were modest wooden structures near the Thames, others more established, with tiled floors and separate male and female hours. But over time, the reputation of these bathhouses changed. As early as the 14th century, records begin to show mounting concern. The stews were becoming associated with improper behavior, private rooms, late-night gatherings, and moral laxity. London's authorities took notice. In 1161, King Henry II issued a royal charter regulating the bathhouses in Suffolk. The document did not shut them down, but it placed them under strict rules. No women were to serve there except the wives of the bathhouse keepers. No one was to remain overnight. The rules were clear but difficult to enforce. As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, anxieties about the body and disease began to rise. The Black Death had shaken Europe to its core, and though its exact cause was unknown, water and shared spaces came under suspicion. In the 15th century, syphilis arrived in England, a new and terrifying disease. Poorly understood, but rapidly spreading. Physicians and clergy alike began to blame bathhouses. The logic was simple, if flawed. Where there was skin, steam, and shared water, there must be contagion. By the reign of Henry VIII, the decline was rapid. In 1546, he issued a formal proclamation. All bathhouses in London were to be closed permanently. The reasoning was a mixture of public health, religious reform, and moral pressure. The Reformation, sweeping through England, viewed the bathhouses as dens of vice. Public bathing, especially in mixed company, was seen as dangerously indulgent, even sinful. And so they vanished. The warm tubs were dismantled. The hearths went cold. The wooden basins were repurposed, and with them disappeared a tradition of communal cleanliness that had endured for centuries. What replaced them was not a new wave of private hygiene, but rather a period of retreat. People washed less, not more. Fear of disease turned cleanliness inward, cautious, and increasingly tied to dry methods: perfume, linen, and brushing. In the countryside, the bathhouse closures mattered little. Most villagers had never used them, but in cities, something was lost. A space of ritual, of conversation, of human touch and warmth. The bones of these buildings still turn up beneath the street styles cracked with age. Hearthstones blackened with soot, drains clogged with soot and hair. And in the records of the city clerks and parish councils, quiet echoes of a forgotten cleanliness remain, a time when washing was not only permitted but expected. Now we descend into the lesser-seen corners of medieval hygiene, beneath floorboards, behind garden hedges, and under castle towers. These were the places where waste went, and though they were rarely spoken of in song or sermon, they were essential. Privies. Every household, from the grandest manor to the humblest hut, had to answer the same question: where does it go? In peasant cottages, the answer was often simpler: pit dug behind the home, covered with a wooden board, or left open during the day. Some used chamber pots emptied into fields or ditches. Others walked to the edge of town or the woods. It was functional, modest, direct. In towns and cities, things became more complex. Houses, especially multi-family tenements, sometimes shared a communal privy built over a cesspit. These were enclosed outhouses made of timber or stone, with a bench seat cut with a simple hole. The waste fell into a pit below, dug deep to delay the need for emptying. Over time, however, these pits filled, and then came the gong farmers. These were monophan, working at night, who emptied cesspits by hand. Armed with shovels, leather aprons, and carts, they hauled the contents out through back alleys and dumped them into larger/urban waste sites or farmland outside the city walls. The work was foul, but respected in its own way. It kept the city moving. Castles had their own systems. Many featured garderobes, small stone chambers built into the outer wall, where waste dropped down a vertical shaft into the moat or a pit. These were often positioned near sleeping quarters for convenience. Some even had small wooden doors to allow air and light. A few had rudimentary drainage channels to carry waste away with diverted rainwater. The name garderobe, literally guarding the robes, comes from the belief that hanging garments in these spaces helped deter lice and moths. The strong ammonia in the air acted as a natural repellent. Monasteries, with their more structured designs, sometimes featured rows of latrines set overflowing water diverted from nearby streams. These raredoors, literally back places, were communal but clean by the standards of the day. Waste was carried away, flushed by gravity and time. Archaeological digs have uncovered these systems in remarkable detail. Layers of compacted soil reveal not only the infrastructure, but the objects lost to them: spoons, belt buckles, pins, and even small coins dropped and unretrieved. From cesspits and latrines, scientists have recovered ancient parasite eggs, pollen grains, seeds, and textiles. These finds tell us what people ate, what illnesses they carried, even what they wiped with rags, moss, hay. Some urban regulations, especially in Northern Europe, even dictated the materials permitted for such use to prevent clogging shared sewers. The smells must have been constant, but the people of the Middle Ages adapted. They lit incense, burned herbs, or simply endured. Fresh air was valued, and houses were built with shutters that opened to the breeze. No glass, just air and faith. The management of human waste was an unglamorous but essential part of life, and in solving it, medieval society showed a quiet ingenuity. They dug, drained, swept, and hauled by hand, with patience and without illusion. In these unseen spaces, beneath stone and soil, a hidden network of hygiene lived and functioned, humble, smelly, but vital. Let us step now into the world of extraordinary privilege. Through high-arched doors and down velvet-draped halls, we enter a royal court, perhaps that of France or England or the Holy Roman Empire. Here everything is gilded, ceremonial, and endlessly rehearsed, even hygiene. Among the elite, cleanliness was not just a habit, it was performance, a form of presentation, of power. Imagine the start of a king's day. Before courtly matters, before council or audience, came the ritual of the rising. This was not done in solitude. The king awoke before an assembly of attendants. Robes were lifted, basins brought in, hands and face washed with water, perfumed with herbs. Towels warmed by the fire were handed with a slight bow. This act, repeated daily, was a symbol, a reminder to all watching that even the simplest human functions of the king were elevated above the ordinary. Royal baths were elaborate affairs. In palaces, large copper tubs were sometimes inset into tiled floors. Water was poured by servants, its temperature carefully adjusted. Screens were arranged for privacy, and herbs steeped nearby released calming aromas. Muslin curtains, linens, and combs were prepared in advance. After bathing, the monarch might be anointed with oils: rosemary for invigoration, rose for softness. But for all the grandeur, even royalty faced limitations. There was no running water, no plumbing. Heated water had to be carried from distant kitchens. Waste had to be disposed of by hand. And the sheer number of body servants, courtiers, guards meant that odors were never far from memory. To mask this, perfumes were lavishly used. Royal wardrobes included scented gloves, pomanders, and even belts stitched with aromatic resins. Rooms were fumigated with burning herbs. Tapestries and carpets, though beautiful, trapped smells. So windows were thrown open often, even in winter. Royal laundries worked constantly. Fine linens were washed in large copper kettles, then beaten, boiled, and laid flat to dry. Clothing was not washed frequently, too delicate, but undergarments and bedclothes were. And these items, though never seen by outsiders, were maintained with fastidious care. Noblewomen followed similar routines. Their morning ablutions included washing the face with milk or rosewater, brushing hair with boar-bristle combs, and dusting skin with soft powders. They rarely bathed fully, especially in winter, but were carefully attended to. A lady might have several maids, each responsible for different tasks: dressing hair, preparing water, folding linens. Toilets for the nobility varied. Some had cushioned wooden seats placed over removable chamber pots, emptied daily by footmen. Others used enclosed garderobes. The smell was mitigated with flowers, herbs, and, on occasion, small clay burners filled with incense. Cleanliness was a visible layer of status. To appear polished, skin soft, nails trimmed, garments pristine, was to display control over one's body and time. The poor could not afford such luxuries. The wealthy made them routine. Yet, for all this effort, illness still came. The plague did not pause for silk robes or gilded basins. But even so, the royal court held fast to its rituals. Perhaps because, in a world of uncertainty, these habits offered stability. A reminder that order could be restored, at least for a moment, with warm water, scented oils, and folded linen. In these acts of cleanliness, carefully choreographed and quietly essential, we glimpse a truth of the royal household. Beneath the wealth and spectacle, they too craved comfort, control, and a sense of purity in a world that often refused to provide it. In the rhythms of medieval life, the seasons were not merely a backdrop. They were the governing force behind every routine, every chore, every quiet struggle. And just as planting, harvesting, and mending followed the turn of the year, so too did cleanliness. There was no concept of spring cleaning as we know it. Yet seasonal hygiene rituals marked the calendar in quiet, familiar ways. In spring, when the days grew longer and the frost finally withdrew, households stirred. The hearthrug, burdened with soot and ash from winter fires, was scraped clean. Chimneys were swept with bundles of thorny branches. Window shutters were unlatched more often, letting in the chill breeze to flush out months of trapped air and smoke. Rugs and rushes were taken outside, beaten with sticks, hung over low hedges. Not to sterilize, such a concept was unknown, but to refresh, to shake off the worst of the soot and dust. Walls, darkened by candle smoke, might be scrubbed with cloths soaked in vinegar and water. It was slow work, repetitive, but it brought a sense of clarity. Bedding, too, was renewed. Mattresses were turned and aired. Straw was replaced with fresh bundles. Linen sheets, if the family had them, were laundered and stretched taut over wooden frames to dry in the sun. Woolen blankets were brushed and left to absorb the clean wind of early spring. Summer brought its own patterns. With rivers flowing strong and the sun high, this was the time for full-body bathing, more common now than at any other point in the year. Families walked to streams and ponds, washed clothes and limbs together, and allowed garments to dry slowly over rocks or hanging poles. Children were more often barefoot in summer, and feet were scrubbed at night. Dust and sweat were constant companions, and though the effort to remain clean was never-ending, the warmth of the season made it more possible. Autumn narrowed the window again. Cleaning focused on preparing for winter. Firewood was stacked, chimneys inspected. Households were swept more thoroughly, and clothing repaired before the cold returned. Lice were more of a concern now, so heads were trimmed and woolens inspected. Oils infused with rosemary or garlic were rubbed into scalps or placed on bedding. And in winter, hygiene took on a different shape. With water often frozen and homes sealed tightly, bathing became rare. Instead, people relied on dry washing, wiping the skin with cloths, brushing hair carefully, and changing linen more often, if supplies allowed. Clothes were dried by the fire, not washed. Skin was protected with animal fats or salves made from wax and herbs. Scented sachets, lavender if you had it, juniper or dried thyme if you didn't, were tucked into chests and closets to fight the rising must. Even simple acts like washing hands or faces became an effort in winter. Water had to be warmed by fire. Hands turned red from the cold, but still families persisted. They wiped, they folded, they brushed. Cleanliness was not about luxury. It was about the small comfort of control, a defense against the creeping disorder of mud, smoke, and time. And so the cycle repeated, year after year. The clean rushes in spring, the sun-warmed sheets in summer, the crackling hearth and quiet brushing of wool in the bitter dark of winter. It was not constant, it was not clinical, but it was real, and it speaks, even now, to a very human truth, that in every season people sought to live with caravan in the face of inevitable dirt. Let us now travel beyond the usual lanes of European history to the learned cities of the Islamic world, to a different tradition of cleanliness, one grounded in science, religion, and medical scholarship. Here, in the heart of the 11th century, lived a physician named Ibn Batlan, born in Baghdad, a city of immense knowledge and refinement. He was a Christian Arab doctor whose writings would ripple across centuries. His most famous work, Taqwim al-Saya, or the maintenance of health, offered not just cures but a philosophy of life deeply tied to hygiene. This guidebook, structured like a calendar, was organized around 6 principles of health: air, food and drink, movement and rest, sleep, emotions, and excretion. Cleanliness was woven into all of them. Ibn Batlan emphasized the importance of bathing not just for removing dirt, but for regulating the body's internal balance. He advised regular baths in warm water, followed by gentle massage with perfumed oils. He warned against bathing or in water that was too cold. Hygiene was not incidental, it was foundational. He paid close attention to the timing of meals, the cleanliness of utensils, the airing of rooms, and the scent of one's garments. His guide suggested changing clothes often and washing linens regularly to prevent putrid vapors from weakening the body. He encouraged the brushing of teeth with miswaka, natural twig still used today for oral care, valued for its antiseptic and aromatic properties. Batlan also addressed cities. He wrote about ventilation, recommending that homes be built with windows to allow for circulating air. He encouraged shaded courtyards and flowing water features, not only for beauty, but for cooling and purification. His ideas were not isolated. They were part of a broader Islamic tradition that placed heavy emphasis on personal hygiene rooted in religious obligations like ablution before prayer, the washing of hands and feet, and the regular cleaning of clothes and bodies. What made Ibn Batlan unique, however, was how he synthesized practical medicine with a vision of balance and order. His books circulated widely, translated into Latin, reaching scholars in Sicily, Spain, and eventually Northern Europe. In medieval Christian cities, simplified adaptations of his work, like the Tacinum Sanitatis, were printed and illustrated, spreading his influence even further. In one such manuscript, a noblewoman is shown combing her hair in the morning light. In another, a young man bathes under a flowering tree, while an attendant hands him a towel. These images, though idealized, echo Butlin's vision. Hygiene not as struggle, but as serenity. He lived in a world of scholars, merchants, and physicians, who walked tiled courtyards and visited libraries cooled by carved stone windows. A world where the scent of rosewater was not luxury, but routine. And so, from his writing desk in Baghdad or Aleppo, Ibn Butlin shaped the way people thought about cleanliness for centuries, quietly, calmly, and with extraordinary clarity. Even now, in the simplicity of his advice, the linens rinse the mouth, clean the skin, we hear something enduring, a thread of common sense strung gently across the centuries. Step softly now into a world of quiet fragrances, of cloisters steeped in lavender, of woolen garments dusted with ground herbs, of churches that smell faintly of smoke, wax, and frankincense. This is not the sterile scent of antiseptic, but the layered human scentscape of the medieval world. While much of the past is imagined in mud and mire, the truth is more nuanced. The medieval world had its own sensory order, and scent played a vital role in hygiene, social identity, and spiritual life. People used fragrance to cleanse, to comfort, to conceal. In households of modest means, herbs were gathered, dried, and bundled. Mint, marjoram, sage, and thyme planted near doorways, scattered across floors, hung from rafters. These plants were believed to purify the air and deter pests. When rushes were replaced on the floor, they were often mixed with fragrant leaves, releasing scent with each step. Clothing, too, was perfumed, especially in wealthier homes. Garments were kept in wooden chests lined with herbs or scent pouches. The chests themselves were sometimes rubbed with oils. Linen handkerchiefs were dipped in rosewater and carried in sleeves. Gloves were perfumed with orange blossom, clove, or ambergris. One popular tool was the pomander, a small, often spherical container filled with a blend of resins, herbs, and oils. Worn on a chain or tucked into a pouch, it offered a portable shield against foul air, especially in cities. The ingredients varied: myrrh, musk, nutmeg, rose petals, cinnamon. Some were intricate, crafted in silver or gold filigree, with compartments for different scents. Others were simple wooden balls or hollowed fruits. These were not just for comfort. In an age when disease was believed to spread through miasmabad, air scent was protective. A sweet-smelling object was a barrier against unseen danger. In churches and monasteries, the air itself was curated. Frankincense and myrrh were burned during services. The smoke carried prayers upward and also covered the smell of crowds. In infirmaries, juniper branches were burned to disinfect the air. In plague years, large censers were carried through the streets, trailing a haze of perfumed hope. Perfume itself was a product of careful craft. Apothecaries distilled flower essences using alembics, producing oils and waters that were sold in tiny glass vials. Rose water, violet water, and camphor oil were used not just on skin, but in cleaning. Water infused with rosemary might be used to wash the face. Lavender was steeped in wine to create a scented rinse for garments or hair. even among the poor, scent mattered. Garlic, onion skins, and sharp herbs were rubbed on doorposts to ward off illness. Bundles of dried flowers hung in cradles. A scrap of rosemary might be tucked under a pillow, believed to bring calm and keep away fever. And in all this, the layering of cloth, the slow evaporation of oil, the burning of herbs, was a recognition of the power of scent. It shaped space, it signaled status, it offered small comforts in a world of rough textures and coarse realities. Today, the fragrances have long faded, but in quiet corners of excavated houses, in the residues left in jars, and the soot marks on ceilings, we glimpse their presence. A world once alive with scent soft, purposeful, and woven gently into daily life. Behind the heavy curtains of noble chambers, beyond the reach of courtiers and guests, lived a quieter world. One not ruled by titles or ceremonies, but by brushes, basins, and whispered routines. This was the world of the ladies-in-waiting. They were noble women, often young, often ambitious, placed in service to queens, duchesses, and princesses. Their role was more than decorative. They managed wardrobes, tended to private needs, and most intimately oversaw the hygiene of the household's most visible women. Their mornings began early. A lady-in-waiting would enter her mistress's chamber with soft footfalls, carrying a basin of warm water, a cloth, a comb. She might light a small brazier, letting the room warm slightly before the day's duties began. A linen chemise would be aired and laid out. A towel would be folded neatly by the side of the washstand. Personal hygiene for noble women was a layered task. Face washing came first, fusing rose water or a mild vinegar diluted in clean water. The skin was patted dry, not scrubbed. Then the hair was untangled with combs carved from bone or ivory, slowly, gently, while standing near the light. Hair might be oiled lightly with rosemary or bay leaf essence, then braided into controlled coils or bound with ribbons. Hands and arms were wiped with cloths scented with floral infusions. Feet, depending on the season, might be cleaned and dried thoroughly, especially in winter, when cold, damp conditions led to soreness and cracked skin. Nails were trimmed with small knives, cleaned, and sometimes polished with pumice stone. Tooth care varied, but among the elite, dental powders made of sage ash or crushed herbs were sometimes applied using fingers or bits of linen. The breath was freshened with cardamom, fennel, or clove, and all of this was managed by the lady-in-waiting, who observed the body, anticipated its needs, and offered her services with discretion. She herself followed similar routines. Though of lower status, she had access to the same oils, waters, and tools, just less elaborately prepared. Her hands bore more work. Her hours were longer. But she, too, combed her hair each morning, washed her face, and changed her linen shift when the laundry cycle allowed. Beyond cleanliness, her role included wardrobe care. Dresses were brushed to remove dust and hair. Underlayers were checked for sweat stains or wear. Perfumed sachets were inserted into sleeves or pinned discreetly beneath bodices. Cloaks were aired. Shoes were rubbed with cloths soaked in vinegar or wine to suppress odor. These rituals were not just about vanity. They were a kind of armor. In the courtly world of whispers and glances, the polished appearance of a noblewoman reflected not just on herself, but on her entire household. A wrinkle, a stain, a misplaced hairpin, these were noticed. And so the ladies-in-waiting watched carefully, adjusted quickly, and carried small scent bottles in hidden pouches. Privacy was rare. Baths, if taken, required servants to carry heated water, arrange screens, and prepare towels. When the mistress bathed, her attendants assisted handing oils, folding linens, drying hair, and when the bath was done, they gathered every cloth, every wet garment, and carried it all back for laundering or airing. It was quiet, repetitive work, but within it lay a form of mastery over fabric, scent, light, and gesture. These women were rarely recorded by name. Their words are lost, their routines unspoken in history books, but their fingerprints linger in the neat folds of preserved gowns, in the combs found buried in keepsake chests, in the faded notes from household inventories listing 8 vials of rosewater and 2 combs of horn. They were the caretakers of comfort, the guardians of cleanliness in a world that demanded beauty and order, even beneath layers of grime and dust. Now picture yourself on the move, not within the stone walls of a castle or the wood frame of a village home, but out on the open road, dust underfoot, wind at your back. You are traveling in the Middle Ages, and hygiene travels with you just differently. Whether pilgrim, merchant, or messenger, life on the road was marked by exposure to weather, to strangers, to dirt. Pilgrims, in particular, traveled light. Their packs held little more than a change of linen, a flask for water, a staff, and a pouch of coins or relics. Personal hygiene was pared down to essentials: a comb, often tied to a belt, a small cloth for wiping sweat or washing hands, a vial of vinegar or rosewater, if the traveler could afford such luxury. At inns or abbeys, washing stations were often provided, stone basins set near doors, with a servant who poured water over the hands of guests. In monasteries, this act carried symbolic meaning, purifying the traveler before sharing in the common meal. In roadside inns, it was more practical: remove the dust, rinse the hands, restore civility. Bathing was rare on the road. When possible, travelers sought rivers, streams, or fountains. A quick wash of the feet, hands, and face could refresh the body after hours of walking or riding. In winter, water was often too cold to touch. Instead, dust was brushed off. Linen shifts were shaken out and aired when the opportunity arose. Merchants, more prosperous than pilgrims, sometimes carried additional items: small flasks of scented oil, toothpicks, or twigs for chewing. They stayed in better inns, where towels might be provided, and where heated water could be requested for a fee. Messengers who often moved quickly and alone had little time for comfort. They wiped their faces with damp cloths, combed hair quickly before reporting to noble courts, and endured long days in sweat-drenched garments. Their horses were better tended than their own bodies at times. But despite these limitations, hygiene was not forgotten. Along pilgrimage routes, bathhouses did exist, particularly near holy sites or towns known for hospitality. Some towns had public fountains, fed by spring-fed aqueducts, where travelers could wash discreetly. And many shrines offered water blessed by clerics, used to wash away more than dust meant, to cleanse sin as well. Shoes were another matter. Most travelers wore leather shoes or boots, rarely removed until the day's journey ended. Feet were blistered, sore, and in need of soaking. Some carried herbsmint, thyme, or pine needles to tuck into boots and stave off odor. And at night, in roadside fields or crowded inns, travelers laid out their belongings. Linen hung from rafters to dry, cloaks shaken out, boots placed near the hearth. They rubbed sore muscles with oil or lard, brushed lice from collars, and washed their hands with cold water drawn from nearby wells. It was basic, often insufficient, but it was routine. Travelers adapted. They found stillness where they could. They welcomed even the smallest opportunity to rinse, to brush, to soften their discomfort. Hygiene in this moving life became not a luxury, but a form of resilience. And so, in every comb tied to a belt, in every cloth dipped in cold stream water, we see a quiet echo of care. The persistence of order on roads that offered very little of it. Now we find ourselves in the 14th century, in the Italian city of Siena, where cobbled streets wind through sun-warmed buildings, and bells echo from towers high above. Here lived a woman whose devotion to purity redefined the meaning of cleanliness, not of the body, but of the soul. Her name was Catherine of Siena. Born in 1347, the youngest of 25 children, Catherine entered a deeply religious life early. By the age of 7, she had committed herself to God, and by her early 20s, she had become a figure of intense spiritual authority. She wrote letters to popes, she mediated political conflicts, she tended the sick during plague outbreaks, and she lived in radical simplicity. To Catherine, physical cleanliness was both secondary and symbolic. She saw the body not as something to be glorified or pampered, but as a vessel for divine service. Her approach to hygiene was austere sometimes, startlingly so by modern standards, but always rooted in spiritual conviction. She wore a simple woolen robe, she slept on the floor, she ate little, she washed when necessary, but without concern for comfort. Cleanliness for her was tied to humility, yet she was not unclean. Her linen garments were kept in order. She bathed those around her, especially the ill and the poor, with tenderness. In plague hospitals, she wiped faces, cleaned wounds, and changed bed linens herself, even when others fled. This paradox of denying her own body while tending so carefully to others reflects a central tension in medieval sanctity. Personal austerity was seen as virtuous, but cleanliness in the service of others was holy. Catherine's letters often used the language of hygiene to describe spiritual struggle. She wrote of purging sin, of bathing the soul in divine light. She described pride as a stain and prayer as a cleansing flood. She did not believe that washing the skin brought salvation, but she believed deeply in the dignity of the human form when suffering, even when soiled, and her actions bore that belief. Contemporaries described her carrying water to the dying, scrubbing their feet, combing their hair. She offered not just comfort, but presence. Her touch was not clinical, it was devotional. When she died in 1380, at the age of 33, her body was cared for by those who had witnessed her quiet acts of hygiene. They preserved locks of her hair. They washed her face one final time, and they honored her not with silks or perfumes, but with the linen she had worn in life. Today, Catherine is remembered as a mystic, a reformer, and a saint. But beneath the visions and writings is something gentler, a record of daily care, of washing soiled feet, of cooling fevered brows, of changing bedclothes in plague-ridden wards when no one else would. In Catherine's story, we find a different kind of hygiene, not tied to wealth or science, but to love, a purity born of service. And in the quiet spaces between her letters and her miracles, we see it clearly, the slow, steady work of making others clean, one touch at a time. Now turn your gaze to something simple, something so ordinary it rarely appears in records. yet quietly shaped the texture of medieval hygiene. The act of airing clothes, not washing, not scrubbing, just air, wind, and time. In a world without washing machines or drying racks, cleanliness often meant freshness. And for most households, the sun and the wind were trusted allies. Picture a village green. On a mild day, linen shifts and undergarments flutter from lines strung between poles or hang over wooden fences. Blankets are draped across hedgerows. Tunics are spread on rocks. The breeze moves gently across the cloth, pulling away moisture, odors, and the heaviness of daily use. This actoring clothes was universal. Among the poor, garments were fewer. Washing took time and resources, so between full washings, clothes were aired. Each morning, a tunic might be shaken out and hung for an hour near the hearth, or outside if the weather permitted. Bedding was dragged to the windowsill, cloaks hung from doorposts. Even in cities, space was found. Upper windows of townhouses featured small wooden arms called cloth poles from which residents hung laundry above the street. On balconies, garments waved like soft flags above the bustle below. In back alleys, makeshift lines ran from wall to wall, forming corridors of drying cloth. The practice served multiple purposes. It reduced dampness, especially in winter. It softened cloth, stiffened by sweat or smoke. It allowed coarse woolens to shed dust and mites. And it restored a certain sense of order, visual proof that something had been tended to. In monasteries, airing was ritualized. On designated days, monks and nuns opened storage chests, carried out folded robes, and laid them in rows upon the grass. This was not idle luxury, it was maintenance. Fabric lasted longer when cared for in this way. Linens were less likely to rot or attract mold. Among the wealthy, servants managed complex laundry cycles. After washing, clothes were often finished by airing, laid out on drying cloths or hung over rails near windows. Some castles featured dedicated solar chambers, south-facing rooms where sunlight was invited in for this very purpose. The scent of sun-warmed linen, faintly sweet, was as prized then as it is today. Airing was also a form of prevention. Without understanding bacteria, people still noticed that fresh air helped avoid illness. A musty room was unhealthy. A damp tunic invited sickness. So chests were opened, bedclothes shaken, capes hung by open shutters. Sometimes herbs were added to the mix. Cloth was laid over lavender, rosemary, or dried wormwood, giving garments a faint, lingering scent. Sprigs of rue or thyme were tucked into folds. When aired together, they gave off subtle blends of sharpness and comfort. Textiles themselves told a story. Linen was prized for its cleanliness. Sit could be boiled, whitened, bleached by the sun. Wool, harder to clean, relied more on airing and brushing. Furs were scraped and smoked to preserve them, then aired to remove the smell. Each fabric had its ritual. Archaeological digs rarely reveal clotheslines, but they uncover storage chests, folding benches, and bundles of cloth stored with dried herbs. The absence of soap residue on many everyday garments hints at a different kind of hygiene, one less wet, more thoughtful. So the next time you see a line of garments swaying in the breeze, think of their long heritage, of peasants and nobles alike, standing quietly in doorways, watching the wind do its work. This was not laziness. It was care in its most elemental form. Within the serene walls of a medieval monastery, where chanting echoed across cold stone and candles flickered in long corridors, there existed a quieter layer of labor. While the choir monks prayed, studied, and copied texts, the lay brothers worked, tending fields, baking bread, and upholding the monastery's hygiene. These men were not monks in the full liturgical sense. They had taken vows, yes, but their days were not measured in psalms and scrolls. Instead, they moved through kitchens, gardens, and lavatoriums, carrying buckets, scrubbing floors, and emptying waste. It was the lay brothers who handled the physical maintenance of cleanliness. Each large monastery had a lavatorium, a long stone basin, usually located near the refectory. Here, monks washed their hands before meals, as required by rule and tradition. The water ran through lead or ceramic pipes, often gravity-fed from cisterns or diverted streams. Clean hands were a symbol of discipline and readiness for holy things. But who filled the cisterns? Who scrubbed the troughs? The lay brothers. Every morning, before the bell for prime, they would rinse the basin with cloths soaked in vinegar or hot water. They would refill pitchers, sweep away any fallen rushes, and inspect the drainage to prevent buildup of algae or rot. In winter, this work was harder. Water froze, pipes cracked, but still the rituals continued. Elsewhere in the monastery, privies needed constant attention. These were often positioned at the far end of dormitories or cloisters, built over pits or streams. The reredorer, or latrine block, might accommodate dozens of users. Ventilation was poor, but the flowing water systems, ingenious for their time, helped carry waste away. Once again, the upkeep fell to the lay brothers. They shoveled out cesspits when needed. They checked for blockages. They gathered ashes to scatter over the wasteland, early deodorizing method, and they bore the task without complaint, their labor seen as service to the divine. Laundry was their responsibility as well. Monastic habits, simple tunics of wool or linen, were laundered at regular intervals, more frequently than among peasants. The brothers boiled garments in large copper cauldrons, stirring with wooden paddles. They rinsed them in cold water, wrung them out, and laid them over hedges or wooden frames to dry in the cloister garth. They also made soap. In some monasteries, especially in southern Europe, brothers rendered animal fat with lye, creating coarse bars used for clothes and sometimes skin. Soap making was a seasonal task, done outdoors and carefully measured. Yet their labor did not end at the physical. Lay brothers were trained in routines of order. Bed linens were changed on schedule. Combs and razors were cleaned and stored properly. The infirmary was kept spotless, its floors scrubbed, its bedding rotated. Herbs were hung from beams to sweeten the air, lavender, tansy, and rue among them. The result was an environment of unusual cleanliness for the era. Visitors to monasteries often remarked on the tidiness of the grounds, the freshness of the halls, and the calm of the air within. They might not see the hands that made it so, but the work was ever present. And when a monk died, it was the lay brothers who washed his body, dressed him in clean robes, and prepared him for burial. Their final act of service, in this hidden domain beneath the chants and incense hygiene, was a form of devotion, quiet, repetitive, unseen, and entirely necessary. Now let us move to the heart of every household, whether manor or hut, the kitchen, a place of heat, smoke, and constant use, and, despite appearances, a place where hygiene mattered more than most would assume. The medieval kitchen was not sterile, it was not quiet, but it was tended. Imagine a small village home. The hearth takes center stage, stone-lined, blackened from years of fire. Iron pots hang from hooks. A wooden table bears the marks of many meals, knife scars, scorch marks, darkened rings from dripping ladles. But each morning, before the fire is stoked and the stew begun, cleaning begins. Ash from the hearth is swept into a bucket. The floor-packed earth or stone is cleared of scraps. Utensils are rinsed in cool water drawn from a well or stream. A cloth, damp with vinegar or lye water, is passed over cutting boards and ladles. These are not deep cleans, but they are steady. Ritual. In wealthier homes, a scullery maid or kitchen boy handles the routine. Pans are scoured with sand and ash. Knives are wiped clean and oiled with fat to prevent rust. Copper pots are polished with sour wine. The table is scrubbed with salt or strong-smelling herbs, mint, sage, or wormwood to deter insects and refresh the air. Cleanliness in the kitchen was not about luxury. It was survival. A dirty knife could sour the food. A moldy pot could spoil the stew. Insects and rodents were constant threats, so measures were taken. Bread bins were covered in cloth. Cheese was hung from rafters. Smoke kept flies away. Salt preserved meat, and vinegar was added to rinsing water. Serving vessels, bowls, wooden spoons, ceramic cups were washed with water, then dried over hearth racks or in the sun. Linen napkins, when available, were boiled periodically and beaten dry. In noble kitchens, footmen might polish pewter plates before banquets, their arms marked by hours of labor. Even in monasteries, where simplicity reigned, the refectory tables were wiped between meals. Hands were washed before eating on. Act observed not just for piety, but for health. And after the meal, scraps were cleared for livestock or compost. Boards were rinsed, and knives sheathed with care. Water, always carried by hand, was used sparingly. A single bucket might serve for rinsing several tools, with clean cloths used to finish. Drying was done with linen or allowed to happen slowly near the fire. And in winter, when water froze and the hearth smoked heavily, a greater reliance was placed on brushing, wiping, and airing. In towns, food vendors managed hygiene with similar improvisation. Street stalls were cleaned each morning. Wooden counters were scrubbed. Leftover meat was salted or buried in cool earth. Pies and pasties were stored under cloth to keep away dust. Barrels were rinsed and lined anew. Children helped. They swept floors, carried waste, cleaned the mouths of clay jugs with cloths tied to sticks. These chores were passed down, not through instruction, but through imitation. Cleaning the kitchen was a communal act, shaped by necessity, guided by habit. And when the cooking was done, and the fire banked for the night, one last pass was made, wiping spills, hanging pots, covering food. The kitchen slept, still carrying the scent of leeks and broth, smoke and ash. This was not modern sanitation, but it was care, daily, deliberate, physical care, and it kept households functioning, stomachs full, and illness at bay. In the 14th century, as Europe weathered waves of plague, warfare, and hunger, one man stood at the crossroads of tradition and progressa, physician who not only treated wounds but also documented, with unusual clarity, the importance of cleanliness in his craft. His name was Guy de Ch, born around 1300 in southern France. Celiac became one of the most influential medical voices of the Middle Ages, a surgeon by training and a scholar by temperament. He served as physician to several popes and wrote extensively on surgical practices at a time when most such knowledge passed by word of mouth. His most famous work, the Chirurgia Magnior Great Surgery, was written in 1363. It would become a foundational medical text for over 2 centuries, and within it, Sialiac gave surprisingly detailed attention to hygiene. He advised that surgical tools be cleaned before and after use. Not sterilized. Germ theory was centuries away, but rinsed in wine or vinegar, wiped with clean cloths, and kept in dry cases. He recommended boiling linens used in dressings and cleaning hands thoroughly before treating wounds. He wrote of the dangers of corruption, a term that referred not just to infection, but to decay and filth. He observed that pus, odor, and discoloration often signaled deeper issues, and he advised that wounds be cleaned gently using wine-soaked cloth or herbal solutions. His instructions for treating fractures, abscesses, and burns were exacting. Bandages were to be changed regularly. The skin around wounds was to be washed. Leeches. Sialac was also one of the few physicians to remain in Avignon during the Black Death, while many others fled. He described the plague in stark, clinical terms: its progression, symptoms, and its devastating toll on both rich and poor. He treated the sick as best he could and survived, though likely scarred by what he witnessed. Despite the limited tools of his time, Sialac believed in careful observation, restraint in treatment, and the value of cleanliness in surgery. He rejected certain popular remedies, like applying dung to wounds, and criticized those who relied solely on superstition. His writing emphasized not only the medical act, but the environment in which it occurred. He noted that air quality, room conditions, and even the physician's appearance could affect healing. Clean robes, trimmed nails, combed hair, these were not vanity, they were signs of discipline and trustworthiness. In an era when surgeons were often lumped in with barbers and bone setters, Sialiac stood apart. He treated medicine as a science and cleanliness as part of its practice. His books were copied in monasteries, read in universities, and translated into several languages. For generations of surgeons, his words shaped the rituals of the healing hand. And while his understanding of disease was incomplete, his instinct for order, sanitation, and care left a lasting imprint in the hands of Guy de Chauliac. The medieval scalpel was held not just with skill but with respect for the body, for the patient, for the quiet power of cleanliness. In museums and archives today, preserved medieval clothing sits behind glass, delicate, repaired, discolored by time. But in their seams and stitches lies a quiet history of hygiene. Medieval textiles were not just fashion, they were layers of defense against cold, against wear, and often overlooked against filth. Let us look closer. Most people owned few garments. A simple laborer might have 1 or 2 linen shirts, a tunic, perhaps a cloak. Nobles had more, but clothing was still considered valuable, mended again and again. And each layer had a purpose: outer garments for protection, under layers for cleanliness. Linen, closest to the skin, was the secret weapon of medieval hygiene. It was breathable, durable, and most importantly washable. Unlike wool, which could shrink or felt when wet, linen could be boiled and scrubbed. It absorbed sweat and oils from the skin, keeping the outer garments cleaner longer. Because of this, linen underclothes were changed more frequently, not daily, but often enough to become a rhythm. In wealthier homes, this might mean 2 or 3 changes per week. Among the poor, perhaps once a week or less. Still, it was done, quietly, persistently. In monasteries and large estates, Linen garments were marked with small stitches ownership, tags to track them through washing cycles. Soap made from animal fat and lye was used. In some areas, fuller's earth or clay was rubbed into the fabric to lift oil before rinsing. And then there were accessories pieces specifically intended to manage dirt. Cuffs and collars were removable in many tunics, designed to absorb grime and be laundered more easily than the full garment. Head coverings were used not just for modesty, but to protect hair from dust. Veils, coifs, and hoods caught grease and soot, shielding the cleaner hair underneath. Aprons were common among workers and cooks. These absorbed splashes and soot and could be rinsed and reused with less effort than a full shift or tunic. Woolen cloaks were brushed with stiff bristled brushes to remove dirt, especially in winter. Even shoes, though rarely cleaned in a modern sense, were maintained. Leather was rubbed with tallow or wax to repel water. The insides were aired. And in wealthier households, soft slippers or indoor shoes kept floors cleaner and feet dry. Archaeological digs have recovered fragments of these everyday garments. Stains remain, where patterns show where elbows rubbed against tables, where knees bent against floors. Some still bear traces of soap or ash captured in their weave. A few even contain traces of herbal residual lavender, mint, or were used to scent and freshen between wears. These garments weren't discarded casually. When torn, they were patched. When worn through, they were repurposed into rags, wipes, even bandages. Linen, especially, was treasured, reused, until threads pulled apart under the touch. This long life cycle of cloth speaks to a different idea of cleanliness. Not disposal, but maintenance. Not bright whiteness, but freshness and function. And through it all, a quiet discipline. Folding garments carefully, brushing away dust, pinning sleeves to keep them from dragging in food or soil, laying cloaks out to air on hedgerows and windowsills. It was not glamorous, but it was hygiene, sewn into every seam. Let us now journey eastward to the golden roofs and marbled courtyards of Byzantine Constantinople. Here, within the walls of a city that bridged empires and epochs, a different kind of cleanliness thrived, rich with ritual, aesthetics, and a sharp awareness of public impression. Constantinople in the Middle Ages was not only a political and religious center, it was a city of water, of fountains and cisterns, of mosaic-tiled bathhouses and scented oils. Cleanliness among the Byzantine elite was not merely practiced, it was curated. At the heart of elite hygiene was the private bath. Unlike the fading bathhouse traditions of Western Europe, Byzantine aristocrats preserved Roman customs. Wealthy households maintained their own bathing suites, often heated by hypocaust systems inherited from earlier engineering. Steam circulated beneath the floors, warming water and tile alike. Servants would prepare the space before each bath. Oil lamps were lit. Robes and towels were warmed. Water was mixed with rosewater or citrus peels, then poured over the bather in careful measure. No splashing, no haste. Bathing was a meditative act as well as a hygienic one. Body oils were applied before the bath, then scraped off with Strigel's curved metal tools passed gently over skin. This removed sweat, dirt, and oil. The body was then rinsed, patted dry with fine linen, and anointed again with scented balms, often imported from Syria, Egypt, or North Africa. Hair was washed with eggs or plant-based soap, then combed and braided. Nails were trimmed, hands were scented, Clothing made of fine silks or linens was changed daily or near daily. Perfumed sachets were sewn into hems and cuffs. Even shoes were wiped clean before entry into certain quarters of the palace. To the Byzantine elite, physical presentation reflected spiritual and social order. Emperors were expected to appear composed, fragrant, immaculate. They wore white or gold silk. They were attended, constantly combed, wiped, robed, and adorned by eunuchs and stewards trained in the etiquette of appearance. But even beyond the court, Byzantine hygiene habits persisted. Churches featured baptismal fountains and hand-washing basins at their entrances. Ritual washing before prayer was observed. Monasteries practiced frequent ablutions, and in many middle-class homes, jars of scented water sat by the door, ready to greet dusty travelers. This level of hygiene was sustained by infrastructure. Constantinople's aqueducts and cisterns, most notably the Basilica cistern, provided water year-round. Public fountains flowed in markets and courtyards. Even during sieges, water scarcity rarely reached the elite. Clothing was laundered by servants who scrubbed garments in citrus-soaked water or vinegar, then dried them in sunlit terraces. Chamber pots were emptied discreetly, floors swept, incense burned. Cleanliness was part of the domestic architecture itself, and the contrast to the Western courts was striking, where French or English nobles might scent garments to mask days-old sweat. Byzantine elites bathed regularly, sometimes daily, where some European cities feared water after outbreaks of plague. Constantinople maintained its water culture, integrating it into daily life without hesitation. Even their art reflects this attention. Mosaics show men and women with glistening hair, smooth faces, garments that cling like freshly washed linen. Hygiene was embedded into the Byzantine concept of civilization itself. So here, in this eastern capital, cleanliness was not only survival or discipline, it was elegance, a sign of refinement, of continuity with the classical world. In its steam, its oils, its fine linens, fluttering in the wind. The Byzantine court reminded the world that being clean was not merely a matter of the body but of the soul's dignity, as it stood before man and God alike. Step now into a quieter room. A low fire burns in the hearth, its orange glow casting shadows along the wooden beams above. In the corner, under layers of wool and linen, lies an elderly man, his joints stiff, his eyes dim, his voice a whisper. This is the final season of life, and here too, hygiene plays a role. In the medieval household, care for the elderly was often a family matter. There were no hospitals for long-term aging, no care homes in the modern sense. Instead, aging parents lived with children or siblings, tended to with patience, reverence, and improvisation. Cleanliness was part of that tending. The elderly were bathed gently, less frequently than the young, but more carefully. A small basin of warm water was brought to the bedside. A cloth was dipped, wrung out, passed across the face and neck. Limbs were wiped. Hair was combed. Feet, swollen from years of walking, were dried slowly and wrapped in soft linen. Hands, often bent and spotted, were cleaned after meals. Nails trimmed with small knives. Teeth, or what remained, rinsed with herbal water. The mouth might be wiped with a damp cloth dipped in wine or sage infusion. For those too frail to walk, chamber pots were kept within reach. These were emptied by younger relatives or servants. Bedding was changed when soiled. Straw mattresses refreshed with sweet-smelling herbs. In summer, rushes replaced more often. In winter, woolen layers were shaken out and warmed near the fire. When illness came, as it often did, cleanliness became a shield. The body was washed more often, sores cleaned and dressed with honey or salves. Clothing changed daily if resources allowed, and if not, then at least linen underlayers were swapped out and aired while the patient rested. Comfort came from touch, the smoothing of hair, the gentle drying of damp skin, the fluffing of a pillow. Small, repetitive acts, uncelebrated but deeply human. Among the wealthy, servants took on this work. Skilled attendants, often older women, who knew how to manage frailty. They warmed compresses, brewed broth, wiped brows. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. They worked quietly, maintaining a kind of dignity for the fading body. In monasteries and convents, aging monks and nuns were often cared for in dedicated infirmaries. These rooms, positioned near the cloisters, received better air, more light, and regular cleaning. The rule of Saint Benedict called for special attention to the sick and elderly. Clean sheets, clean clothes, warm baths if needed. This was not luxury, it was spiritual duty, and when the end approached, the body was prepared, washed with wine or holy water, nails cleaned, hair smoothed, dressed in clean linen. A final act of reverence. Hygiene, even here, was not about appearance. It was about respect, about allowing someone to end their days in comfort, with their skin clean, their space ordered, their body honored. In these final days, medieval hygiene reveals something deeper beneath the ash, beneath the vinegar and rough linen. Care, quiet, consistent, personal care. And it endures even now. In the 14th century, among the wooded hills of what is now the Czech Republic, a young king discovered a springer, steaming, bubbling surge of water that hissed and frothed from the earth. He was on a hunting trip when it happened, and the place would change the history of hygiene in Central Europe. The king was Charles IV, ruler of Bohemia and later Holy Roman Emperor. The spring he discovered would become Karlovy Vary or Carlsbad, one of the oldest and most renowned spa towns in Europe. But Charles did not just stumble on hot water. He believed profoundly in the power of bathing. Raised in both the Bohemian court and the sophisticated court of France, Charles had seen the value of personal cleanliness not only as a comfort, but as a medicine. He brought those sensibilities home with him, and when he found the boiling spring in the forest, he saw not just an opportunity for rest, but for healing. He ordered the building of facilities around the spring, wooden structures to contain the water, simple tubs carved from timber, and platforms where the sick and the weary could rest. At first, it was only locals who came, but word spread quickly. By the late 14th century, nobles and scholars were traveling to Bohemia to soak in the sulfur-rich waters. Physicians praised the spring's ability to soothe gout, relieve skin conditions, and aid digestion. Charles himself visited regularly, often during bouts of illness or spiritual retreat. He wrote letters describing the healthful nature of bathing, referencing Roman practices and medical texts of the time. Under his patronage, bathing was elevated. It became not just an act of hygiene, but a courtly ritual, a blend of science, faith, and pleasure. And yet these baths were not lavish. They were simple, functional. Warm water drawn into wooden tubs, sometimes shared, sometimes private. Herbs were added, juniper, lavender, sometimes wine. Attendants helped the ill in and out of the water, wrapped them in linen, offered broth, or infused drinks. For Charles, the bath was a place of peace, of reset, of renewal. He made other improvements too. He restored roads so pilgrims and patients could reach the spa more easily. He commissioned doctors to study the waters. He included references to bathing in royal decrees, encouraging cleanliness among his subjects not for show, but for resilience. Even as plague and war swept across Europe, Charles emphasized healing. He supported hospitals, monastic infirmaries, and places where water could be used medicinally. And Karlovy Vary remained central to that vision. After his death, the town grew. By the 15th and 16th centuries, it was known across the continent. Today, the colonnades and fountains still stand, echoes of that original act of royal discovery when a man looked into the steam and saw not just water, but a future. Charles IV left behind many legacies: Gothic cathedrals, universities, legal codes, but his belief in the restorative power of water, the simple dignity of bathing remains a softer, more human contribution. A reminder that hygiene, even then, was not only about scrubbing the skin but about tending the spirit, quietly, warmly, together. Among the stone columns of a medieval cloister, where footsteps echoed softly across flagstone floors and speech was rare, cleanliness took on a different tone. Here, among monks who rose before dawn and prayed by candlelight, hygiene was not about appearance or health alone. It was about rhythm, repetition, quiet order. Cloisters were designed for contemplation, but they were also designed for function. Built around a central garden or green space, they connected the living quarters, library, chapel, and refectory. And along one edge of this sacred square, you would often find a long tropha lavatorium. This was the washing place. Before meals, before certain prayers, before entering the scriptorium, monks would stop here to wash. Water flowed from spouts carved into stone. It pooled gently in a long basin. The act of washing was quiet, no conversation, only the sound of water over skin. Hands dipped, sleeves pulled back. A linen towel passed gently from monk to monk. The practice was both practical and spiritual. Clean hands before breaking bread. Clean fingers before turning the pages of sacred texts. Clean skin as an outward echo of an inward state. Nearby, clothes were maintained. Habits of wool were brushed, not washed frequently, but aired regularly. Linen undergarments were boiled in large copper pots scrubbed by lay brothers, who rose early and worked until the sun passed low over the cloister walls. These routines were not written about often. They were not considered remarkable, but they were deeply embedded, part of the rule, part of the day, and the spaces themselves reflected it. Monastic architecture was designed to move air, to let in light. Cloisters had open arches. Doors faced east to catch the morning sun. Floors were swept daily, especially in the infirmary and refectory. Straw was scattered and replaced, not because it was glamorous, but because it worked. Soap was made on site in some larger communities. Herbs were grown for more than medicine. They were used in cleansing. Rosemary, sage bay, lavender, in the scriptorium, where monks copied manuscripts. Dust was the enemy. Tables were wiped each day, pens sharpened, ink pots sealed, hands kept clean. The sacredness of the text demanded it, and when illness came in, it always did, there was already a system. The sick were moved to separate quarters. Bedding was changed more frequently. Attendants bathed the fevered gently with warm cloths. Linen bandages were rolled and boiled again. The tools of hygiene were ready, waiting. Archaeologists uncover these stories in small ways: drainage channels carefully carved, sluices that led to garden beds, early composting systems, soap residues in pottery, fragments of linen in old laundry yards. Everything quiet, nothing ostentatious, and in the records, sparse notes, a request for more ash, a notation about the towel hooks in the lavatorium, an expense for a new comb. These were not grand moments of reform or revolution. They were daily choices. Wash the hands, all done in silence, all part of the liturgy of life. In these cloisters, cleanliness wasn't shouted, it wasn't performed, it was simply lived. Now let us wander into a more poetic world, one shaped not by necessity, but by ideals. A world of silken sleeves, whispered verses, and glances exchanged behind veils. This is the domain of courtly love, the refined and stylized romances of medieval nobility. And within it, cleanliness played a curious and revealing role. To be desirable was not merely a matter of beauty, it was a matter of care. Knights, poets, and ladies lived by a code, part chivalry, part fantasy, part subtle hygiene. The body, though never explicitly described in these tales, was carefully managed. Breath was to be sweet, hands soft, hair neat, clothing fresh. Bathing featured in the literature of love. In troubadour songs and Arthurian romances, lovers are often described washing before encounters. A lady combs her hair at sunrise. A knight bathes after battle, his wounds cleansed, his body prepared for court. These acts were not sensual in a modern sense. They were symbolic. Cleanliness represented virtue. A well-tended body signaled a well-ordered soul. In real life, nobles mimicked this aesthetic. Women washed their faces with rose water or goat's milk. They rubbed hands with lemon peel or herbs. Their maids applied lightly scented oils to the neck and wrists. Linen veils were laundered carefully white and fine, never stained. Men were expected to present themselves similarly. A knight's armor might be scuffed, but his underclothes were to be clean, his nails trimmed, his beard shaped. Before a feast or festival, he would change garments, wash with scented water, and don a tunic free from spots. Gloves, belts, and purses were infused with fragrances, civet, musk, or floral oils. These scents were not overpowering. They were close, intimate, detectable only in close company. Hair was another focal point. Ladies brushed theirs daily, often with assistance. Long hair was a sign of health and beauty, and cleanliness mattered. Lice were an ever-present concern, so combs were shared only among trusted companions. Scented powders were sometimes applied, rose petals ground with starch. And while full bathing might not occur daily, the area's most visible face, hands, feet, were washed with discipline. Cloths were warmed, fingers rubbed with soft sand or soap, then rinsed. Drying cloths were changed often, especially in wealthier homes. The love letters of the time, too, reference hygiene obliquely. A knight might praise the white of a lady's linen sleeve. A poet might describe the scent of her handkerchief. These were codes, shared among those who understood that physical care was the outer reflection of inner devotion. Even in tournaments and feasts where sweat, dust, and heat were unavoidable, found time to retreat, to change, to freshen. Attendants prepared washing stations. Pages brought scented cloths. A knight might pause between jousts to rinse his face and brush his tunic. These practices were not universal. Not every noble was neat. But among those who played the game of love and image, cleanliness was part of the performance. To be disheveled was to be careless. To be too clean was to be vain. The art lay in balance, fresh enough to charm, restrained enough to suggest effortlessness. And so, behind the ballads and banners, the tournaments and tapestries, medieval romance carried with it the quiet labor of hygiene. A handkerchief soaked in rosewater, a tunic brushed before the feast, a mouth rinsed with wine and mint, not for survival, not for medicine, but for love or the performance of it. Imagine now the pulse of a medieval town on market day. The streets are crowded, wheels creak, chickens cluck, voices rise in haggling cadence. But behind the goods and gestures, there's another constant presence. Yet even here, amid the press of bodies and animal dung, cleanliness was not forgotten. It simply had to adapt. For vendors, especially those selling food, public perception mattered. A butcher could not appear careless. A baker needed to seem trustworthy. And a woman selling herbs or cooked stew needed to look, if not pristine, then at least prepared. So routines formed. Before dawn, stalls were wiped down with wet cloths. Buckets of water, often drawn from public wells, were used to rinse tables and benches. Waste from the day before was swept into the gutters, carried off to dumping grounds, or left for pigs to root through. Vendors who handled produce kept their fingernails clean with small knives. Their clothes were often worn, but freshly brushed. Hands were wiped after every transaction on aprons or cloths tied at the waist. A fishmonger might sprinkle vinegar on her stall to cut the smell. A baker dusted flour from his arms with a flick and a clean rag. For those who could afford it, a small bowl of scented water might sit near the stall, used for rinsing hands or splashing on the face. This wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of. Public fountains were hubs of activity, not just for drawing water, but for washing faces, feet, and even utensils. While bathing in public was discouraged in many towns, washing was tolerated. It was quick, discreet, and usually gender-segregated. Street food sellers maintained a surprising level of order. Skewers were wiped between uses. Wooden bowls were rinsed quickly before being reused. Spoons were sometimes licked, but just as often dunked in shared rinse pots. And despite the odors and noise, cities did try to regulate cleanliness. Guilds imposed standards. Butchers had to discard waste in designated areas. Bakers were fined for dirty ovens or spoiled dough. Market inspectors made rounds, checking weights, inspecting bread, and occasionally issuing fines for unwholesome air. Even barbers, who set up stalls on market corners, observed rituals. Their razors were dipped in wine or hot water, their cloths washed weekly, their hands rinsed often. They couldn't afford to be careless with blades. Shoppers, too, played a part. They wiped fruit with hems. They sniffed bread. They rejected anything that appeared to smudged or poorly kept. The assumption was clear. If you didn't care for your tools, you wouldn't care for your wares. This wasn't modern sanitation, but it was a working rhythm, a kind of negotiated public cleanliness. And at the end of the day, the mess returned. Carts left ruts. Food scraps littered the square. Children splashed through puddles that were more than just water. But then came the sweepers, the buckets, the merchants who stayed behind to rinse down their booths and fold their cloths with care. Market days were not clean, but they weren't filthy either. They were managed, watched, tuned, and for a moment, In the bustle of business and the scent of bread and herbs, the medieval town showed its effort not to be spotless, but to be bearable, presentable, livable. We turn now to the Iberian Peninsula and to one of the most powerful women in late medieval Europe, Isabella I of Castile, the queen who unified Spain alongside Ferdinand of Aragon, funded Columbus's voyage, and presided over both reform and repression. But among the many accounts of her reign lies a curious note acclaim that Queen Isabella bathed only twice in her life. The line is often repeated, sometimes cited as fact, sometimes dismissed as legend. But it speaks volumes about the shifting relationship between power, piety, and cleanliness at the close of the Middle Ages. Born in 1451, Isabella was raised in a court where bathing had already begun to fall out of fashion. Across much of Western Europe, the once thriving bathhouse culture had withered under the combined weight of moral suspicion, the fear of plague, and the influence of religious reformers who viewed bodily indulgence as a path to sin. Isabella, deeply devout, lived with these contradictions. On one hand, she maintained a regal court one known for discipline, order, and image. Her gowns were finely tailored, her hair arranged by attendants, her public appearances choreographed with care. Clean linen was a mark of status, and her household accounts include purchases of rosewater, vinegar, and perfumed cloths. On the other hand, she embraced austerity. Her piety was profound, sometimes severe. She fasted often, slept little, chose plain garments under her robes. Her religious devotion shaped her private behavior, including, it seems, her approach to bathing. Whether she truly bathed only twice is unlikely. More likely, the comment recorded decades after her death referred to full immersion baths. She likely followed the standard practice of partial washing, face, hands, feet, and perhaps hair. Linen underclothes were changed frequently and aired. Herbal rinses might have substituted for water. Her marriage to Ferdinand marked a turning point in Iberian history. Together they established one of the most powerful monarchies in Europe, yet they also oversaw the Spanish Inquisition, a religious crackdown that affected not just belief, but daily life, including hygiene customs passed down by Jewish and Muslim communities. In Granada, just before its fall to Isabella's armies in 1492, Islamic bathhouses still operated. These hammams were marvels of engineering: vaulted chambers, heated floors, flowing water, rituals of scrubbing, rinsing, and rest. But soon after the conquest, many were closed, some were repurposed, others were destroyed. The cultural meaning of bathing shifted rapidly. What had once been a sign of health and social grace became, in the minds of some Christian reformers, a symbol of moral laxity or religious otherness. And so, Isabella's life reflects a broader trend, not personal filth but a redefining of cleanliness itself. From water to linen, from soap to perfume, from washing to wiping, cleanliness remained important, but its expression narrowed, its rituals changed. And in the royal court of Castile, even the queen could claim as a virtue, not a vice, that she had scarcely bathed at all. Whether true or exaggerated, the statement has lasted, not because it tells us about water and skin, but because it marks a turning point, a pivot from the shared baths of earlier centuries to the more private, drier, perfumed cleanliness of the early modern world. As we near the end of our journey, we return once more to the artifacts, the silent remnants of ordinary lives, unearthed not in treasure hoards or palatial vaults, but in pits, wells, and buried cellars. These fragments of hygiene tell a story not often told in textbooks or chronicles. The remains are modest: a bone comb, its teeth worn thin from use; a shard of pottery once used to store lye soap; a wash basin, cracked and patched with care; the corner of a linen sheet stitched with initials. And yet, from these, a pattern emerges, a pattern of maintenance, of small rituals repeated again and again. Archaeologists find wooden scoops worn smooth by water, soapstone fragments ground down from long use in washing, pumice stones used for smoothing skin or cleaning surfaces, and near hearths and latrines, bundles of dried herbs, still faintly aromatic when first uncovered. In cesspits, those unwelcome but revealing archives items long lost are recovered: cloth used for wiping, buttons torn from tunics, small wooden scrapers, rudimentary toothpicks, broken combs. These were not tossed carelessly, they were used until they broke. Even floor layers reveal clues: patterns in rush replacements, telltale silt from water regularly poured for washing, charred marks from incense and dried plants burned to scent the air. At doorways, impressions in the earth where wash basins stood, day after day, season after season. In towns, records describe city ordinances that required homeowners to keep gutters clear, to dispose of waste before dawn, to sweep the fronts of their shops. Fines were issued. But what stands out more is that compliance, perfect as it was, became routine. In households, inventories mention soap not always, but often: 1 bar of Castile soap, 4 linen towels, worn, a comb of horn, cracked. These are the words of ordinary care, folded into wills and ledgers. And among the dead, there is evidence to lice combs in graves, clean linen wrappings, shoes placed at the foot, hair still braided, the final act of tending, even when resources were scarce, tells us something quiet and dignified. They wanted to leave the world as clean as they could manage. Medieval hygiene was not what we know today. There was no sterile perfection, no deep antiseptic cleaning, but there was rhythm, there was thought, there was effort: to scrape the skin with a dull knife, to wash the face with cold water before dawn, to hang linen out to catch the breeze, to clean a wound with wine and bind it with boiled cloth. These were not accidents, they were choices, repeated, valued, remembered. And though time has washed away most of the smells, the textures, the motion of those acts, the evidence remains: care worn into objects, patterns etched into space, a story not of ignorance, but of adaptation, not of filth, but of fragility and persistence. And so, we have traveled softly through the textures of another time, through steaming bathhouses and stone-cold cloisters, past bone combs and lye soap, through basil-scented courtyards, and behind the linen curtains of quiet sickrooms. We have listened, not to the proclamations of kings or the echoes of great battles, but to the smaller rhythms: the washing of hands, the combing of hair, the cleaning of pots, the airing of cloth. The story of medieval hygiene is not a story of dirt, it is a story of effort. In a world without running water, without germ theory, without antiseptics or sterile gloves, people still tried. They worked with vinegar and herbs, with cloth and ash, with ritual and repetition. They swept their floors, they wiped their skin, they cleaned the hands of the dying. It was imperfect, often insufficient, but it was meaningful. And as we return now to our own time, where hot water flows at a touch, where soap is bottled and scented and shelves are lined with balms. We can pause for a moment, not to scoff, but to reflect, to remember that the desire for comfort, for dignity, for some small measure of control over the dust and wear of life is not new. It was there in the rushes-strewn floors of a peasant hut. It was there in the perfumed glove of a noble. It was there in the basin beside the monk's cot. It was there in the cloth wrung out by firelight and in the comb tucked into a pilgrim's belt. They lived as best they could, and in that, perhaps, is something deeply calming, reassuring, human. Thank you for joining us on this gentle journey through time. If you've made it this far, perhaps your eyes are already heavy and your thoughts softened by sleep. But before you drift away, a quiet reminder: if you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing. And if you feel like sharing, let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. We love seeing the quiet corners of the world gathered together. Wherever you are, whatever hour it is, rest well. You are far from the dirt floors and chamber pots now. The linen is clean, the air is fresh, and your place in the present is quiet and safe.